Greetings! This is the second video in my series about starting with watercolors. In the last video, we set up our palette and cleaned up our tools for painting. In this video, we'll be learning about handling the brush. Steps to making a first stroke. The basic process is pretty straightforward. You grab the brush like you would a pencil. You then dip it in the water, making sure it's wet all the way through, and remove the excess water either by running it against the edge of your water container or by dabbing it off on a rag. After that, we move to our semi-dry paint and gently rub the brush in the color to pick up some of it. I like to work the paint on the palette a bit to make sure it mixes evenly with the water in the brush. Then, you bring the brush to the paper and make a stroke. That's the bulk of it. The rest is mostly nuances and habits that will develop through use and errors. I'll go back through each of the steps with more information and some tips, things that I've learned from using paint or by talking with other painters. Holding the brush. There is no good or bad way to hold the brush. It's fine as long as you're comfortable and can do the work you want to do. In general, holding the brush further away from the ferrule, this metal part, will allow you to do more gestural and spontaneous strokes. Holding the brush closer to the hairs will give you a lot more control over your stroke. It's normal to change the way you hold the brush through a painting in order to get the kind of stroke you want. Wetting the brush. This is the part of the brush that it's okay to wet. It's best to avoid wetting this part or anything that goes over the ferrule. If too much water gets into the ferrule, it can loosen the glue that holds everything together and deteriorate the state of your brush. The ferrule can start moving around, or the brush might start shedding its hairs. Should you happen to dip the brush too deep, just take it out and dry it with your rag or a paper towel. Another tip here is to make sure you don't have extra water droplets on your brush before painting, since these can fall down and mess up your painting. And a reminder, never leave your brush in the water container. Picking up pigment. When it comes to picking up some paint, you have to take into account how dry the paint is. Some brands, like Winsor & Newton Professional, tend to dry into very hard cakes. For that kind of situation, it might be beneficial to add a drop of water or to spray the paint with a mister a couple of minutes before painting. Other brands, like M. Graham and Sennelier, will remain semi-moist. In this case, it's best not to add too much water beforehand or the paint will be more difficult to control. The hardness of dried paint can also depend on its pigment, so you truly have to adjust as you work and add more paints to your palette. Making strokes. There are many ways to make a stroke, depending on the angle and how much pressure you put in. The shape of the brush tip can affect that as well. I wouldn't recommend going directly against the hairs, since that's very hard on a brush and can damage it. If you feel like you'd want to do that for texture, make sure you use a very cheap brush. In my demonstration, I used a brush from a set I got at the dollar store. Exercises to practice brush control. Being able to have the brush do exactly what you want it to do is a matter of practice. Pressure, speed, angle, many factors come into play when making a stroke, and it takes some time getting used to it. Here are a couple of exercises that I often do, either for practice or for warm-up. It's a good meditative activity as well. Lines and circles. This activity is something my drawing teacher taught us when we were in school. Basically, you take your drawing instrument, whether it's a pencil, a pen, or a brush, and you try to make lines as close to one another, but you try to make sure they don't touch. So it's a very difficult exercise, especially when you're not warmed up, but it's also very good at working your muscle memory of brush handling. You can try to make it into horizontal lines, vertical lines, diagonals, circles. The kind of lines you make is not as relevant as the attempt at making them really close to one another but not touching. Painting leaves. This is something that, if I'm not mistaken, comes from Chinese brushwork when painting, and it's basically just an exercise in getting used to putting pressure on a brush. So you start your stroke by putting very little pressure on the tip of your brush, so it starts really small, and then you quickly add pressure so the stroke widens, and you try to remove the pressure gradually, so when you pick the brush off the paper, it ends on a very small part of the stroke, so it makes the shape of a leaf. I'm really fond of this exercise because it really does what it's supposed to do. You really get more comfortable with handling the brush and pressure after a while. So it's one I really enjoy doing, and you can play with the colors a bit when you do this one. For this exercise, I usually pick a piece of paper and I will layer the leaves on top of each other, almost to the point where I can't see my strokes anymore. It doesn't really matter if they get on top of one another. It's just a matter of practicing the stroke, so you try to make the best you can of your piece of paper. It's also why I simply turn the page around and use the verso of my sheet of paper to paint these leaves. Being comfortable with a brush in your hand and trusting your muscle memory is, in my opinion, a very important skill. It allows you to paint more intuitively and stay in the zone, not having to step out of it to think about how to make the stroke. It gives you more confidence when painting and informs your knowledge of how to get certain specific effects. Next week, we'll move on to mixing the colors, how to make a color chart from these 3 colors, and understanding the limits of a set of primary colors. I would like to thank the really awesome people at Savoir-Faire for being my collaborators on this video series. Savoir-Faire is the exclusive importer of Sennelier in the US and Canada, as well as other fine art materials. They don't sell directly to artists, but they partner with retailers all over North America, so check your local art store for these beautiful Sennelier paints. Thank you very much for watching, and see you soon!